our speaker, Michael Swanson, Archivist for the Elwyn B. Robinson Department of Special Collections at the University of North Dakota. And as I've said a few times in this group, every time I go looking for a Bygdebok, it tells me it's at the University of North Dakota. So I think we've found the source that we need to help to understand these things. You want to take it away, Michael?
Okay, yes, I can. Thank you, Joel. Welcome, everybody. It's good to see people virtually. This all came about because of suggestion by Johann Onsen, who's visited our department and used our collection on some occasions. And I also see Alexis is here, and she's contacted me several times. So she's very diligent in her research. So I've assisted her by completing some requests for looking up information for her in our Bygdebok collection. So nice to see you. And anybody else that has visited our collection in person, or Linda? Okay, excellent. Well, I'll just start with a brief introduction of myself. So I usually go by Mike, but when I'm corresponding officially with people, I use my full name, Michael. But I grew up in Northwest Illinois, right along the Mississippi River, just north of the Quad Cities, if any of you are familiar with that area. And did my first schooling in Iowa. I have a master's in chemistry from the University of Iowa, and initially worked as a biochemist in the pharmaceutical industry in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And then in the 90s, I kind of got bitten by the genealogy bug. I have Swedish ancestry on my dad's side and Dutch on my mother's side. So I admit my obvious shortcomings in that I do not have any Norwegian ancestry. But some things happened with where I worked, and I decided to go back to school. So I got was able to get accepted at the University of Michigan in their School of Information, and graduated with a Master's of Science in Information, and eventually ended up in my position at University of North Dakota. So I'm around a lot of Scandinavians, so it's a good place to be. And I have some expertise with studying Swedish as well. I've been to Sweden, I think 10 times. So I've studied Swedish a bit, and because of that, it's very similar, of course, to the Norwegian. And so part of what attracted me to my present position was being able to work with the Norwegian Bygdebok collection. I hadn't really looked at any Bygdebøker before I took that position because, of course, I don't have any Norwegian ancestry. But yeah, I've worked with the collection now going on 14 years. So that's of course just part of my job and responsibilities. But I do manage the collection and order books and fill requests as needed with that collection. I'll talk a little bit more about our collection at the end of the presentation. Some of the slides may be, I wasn't sure how experienced everyone was, so some of the things may be very basic, but I will show a couple of examples of resources that I've used to actually find entries in Bygdebøker. So that's going to be the bulk of the presentation. And I think Joel has sent out or will send out a handout that I created for a presentation last year, which has some links to some resources and some tips for using these books for your research. So let me share my screen then.
I think I set it up so you can. There we go. Okay.
All right. And which one is it down here? There it is, slideshow. Okay. And I gotta do one other little thing here, get out of my way. So, and if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat. That's one nice thing about Zoom is you can just put questions into the chat. And hopefully you know how to, you can minimize the windows, the speaking panel, if you want to see as much of the slides as possible. So as many of you probably know, the word Bygdebok is actually a compound word, and these types of words are very prevalent in Scandinavian languages. So they take two or more smaller words and combine them, and sometimes it means something else. So the word Bygd, which is the first part of Bygdebok, it's kind of one of those words that's difficult to get a really good translation into English because we don't have the same equivalent. But a definition that I have settled on is that it's a rural area of settlement. About the nearest comparison to what we have in the US would be a township. But of course, our boundaries with townships and such are determined by surveys, whereas in Norway, a lot of the boundaries would be determined by natural features with the waterways and mountains and such. And then the second word, book, of course, means book. And then the E in between is just a connector between the two words, the two smaller, shorter words. And Bygdebok is the singular, but it changes the vowel and then adds the ER for the plural. So the plural form of the word is Bygdebøker. So what are Bygdebøker? In the simplest or most general sense, they were just considered rural histories of localities in Norway. There is no set template or structure for how the books are created or the information that's provided. So the content in these books can vary widely. Some will be more detailed than others. Usually they're published as a series of books, and in many localities there are books that there are projects that are still going on. Some of these are projects where they may have published a set of books 50, 60 years ago, and they decided they want to update and revise those. In others, there's places where there have been no books that have been published, or maybe it's a large series, and so they come out every 2 or 3 years with another volume in that series. I know there's one extensive series for a place in Østfold in southeast Norway that I think is going to be 20 volumes in total. I think 17 of them are completed. I actually met the author on my last trip to Norway. There are different types of these books. Bygdebøker have kind of developed into their own genre. I think the earliest books were probably published about a century ago. But it took probably several decades, probably not until the mid 1900s, when this really caught on as a type of book to do for areas in Norway. But among the types of books that fall under this category, there can be general histories. So these books are either divided up by time period, where it usually starts with the prehistoric times and goes through the Viking Age, Middle Ages, etc. Or they're divided up by subject, where they have sections or chapters dealing with the geology of the area, natural features, plant life, animal life, the local dialects, traditions, the local government and education and religion and industry. So all kinds of different topics. So if you know a little bit of Norwegian, you can usually determine pretty quickly either by the title or subtitle of the book, or just by looking at the table of contents to determine if it's a general history or not. There are a few books that are on specialized topics. Probably the most common topic that would fall under this category would be immigration. So in some places they have devoted entire volumes to immigration from that area. So that would include usually information about those who emigrated, as well as kind of the more general context about immigration and its impact on that area of Norway. But there are also other special topics that are dealt with. I know in one area they have they've issued a Bygdebok that deals with the regulation of the water in that area. I think they have an extensive network of dams and maybe also use the water for energy production. So they decided to devote an entire volume to that topic. In another area, they devoted a topic to skiing. So that clearly they have a tradition of skiing in that area and decided to publish a book on that. And then there also are some that are pictorial histories. Another category are lineage books, which are in Norwegian usually called Bygdebøker. So these are books that have just kind of the basic genealogical information about the people, usually organized as households. Without any information about the farms themselves. So these books have the genealogical information, but you don't have the additional contextual information about the farm or the places that the people lived. And then we go on to probably the most common type and the one that is of most value to those who are doing Norwegian genealogical research, and those are the farm histories. So these are the books that provide histories about the individual farms in an area, as well as information about the people who are connected with those farms. So often in the title or subtitle, you'll see terms such as gård og slekt or gård og ett, gård or guard. Of course, is translated as farm. A slekt and ett are kind of words about family or relatives and that. So again, these are the books that are that a lot of people just automatically go to when they think about Bygdebøker, although it is only one type of Bygdebok. It's not the only type. So, but some people have that idea that these are the only books in existence that are in this genre. And then in some areas where there are a series of books, they have created separate indexes or registers is usually what they're called in Norwegian. So they have name indexes for the series of books that are the farm histories. So as far as information, and now we're pretty much talking about the farm history type of Bygdebok in this and the subsequent slides. So the information that can be found in the entries in these farm histories, usually you'll have the household. So you'll have the head of the household, the spouse, and then a listing of the children, often with their dates, dates of birth, dates of marriage and death. A lot of times the books will just have the years, not the full dates. I think they do that more for space purposes. If they had to put complete dates for every single person, it would probably make the books significantly longer. So I think they do that just to shorten it up and just make it easier. If a person did emigrate or a family immigrated, a lot of times those details are included. Sometimes it lists exactly where they settle in the US or in other countries. The head of household, it will usually tell where that person came from and the name of the parents, and then also the name of the spouse. And it can include the parents of the spouse. And if they move to another place, it will often indicate what the name of that place is. So a lot of times you'll see that with the children that are in a household, when there'll be a notation that they move to a certain place. So presumably that's when they become an adult and at an age of majority, then they move and settle at a different farm in many cases. The books can also provide some of the more, it gives you a greater understanding of the standard of life, the lifestyle that these people had at different periods in time. So the books can reveal what they had for livestock or animals, as well as what types of crops they grew. If they had a mountain meadow that they used in the summer for their cattle, for grazing and for milking, if they had fishing rights. So details like that can be found in some cases. If they did own property, there can be details about how that property was acquired, when it was acquired, what they purchased it with. And historically, there wasn't any currency, so they would use either animal hides or barrels of grain, things of that nature. So consumables that they produced on their farm that they would use for these transactions. And then also the terms of the sale, if they did eventually sell the property, can also be revealed. If they were husmen or tenant farmers, so if they lived on a place and they worked for the landowner, usually they would be provided a small cottage to live in, maybe a little tract of land for subsistence farming, but the contracts would also stipulate how many days of the year they would work for the landowner. So sometimes those are included in the farm history entries. And if there were court cases, sometimes information about those court cases can also be included. Now, it can be a challenge, and it's usually the most difficult part when I do receive information for a request, is actually determining which Bygdebok will contain information on an individual or a family. So that's oftentimes the most challenging part. And there's different reasons for that. In Norway, redistricting continues to be an activity. So you have merging, consolidation of the kommuner, which are the local municipalities. So these are the local government entities. You also have, it happened just a couple years ago where they consolidated some of the fylker, which are the, it'd be equivalent to our states. Those are the largest districts in Norway. So there used to be 18, I believe, of these fylker, and now I believe it's 10 that they have, and they've changed names of some of them. So it's made it a little difficult if you're using sites that are using these newer land districts and trying to figure out which of the older historic ones are included in the new ones. And we don't have that issue here in the US. We don't have states changing boundaries or counties changing boundaries. So it's kind of an alien term to us, but in Norway and in other European countries, redistricting is still taking place. There's also the issue with common names. This is not only for place names, but for individuals with the patronymic naming system. So you can have, a lot of the place names are equivalent to descriptions of geological features, so physical features on a property. And so if some of these are going to be, there's going to be numerous places, there is the potential for numerous places of the same name to be present in a single place. So there is a challenge in to figure out which one is the right one for the people of interest. Spelling variations is always an issue. There are older spellings in records, depending on which record you're looking at. And a Bygdebok might be using the newer spellings. So there was, I think, a spelling reform in the early 1900s in Norway. So it standardized a lot of the spelling. So before that, something could be spelled somewhat different than it is today. Some of the smaller holdings may not be indexed in a book. So that poses a challenge in trying to figure out exactly which larger or main farm a place might be associated with. And also there are places that have been abandoned over time. So there may have been people living there in the mid 1800s, but maybe the place was difficult to get to. And after a while, it kind of fell into disrepair, and the place is just no longer there. Some of the Bygdebøker actually will address these places, but it can be a challenge to determine that unless you can find some reference to these abandoned places. Similar to that, I have okay, there we go. I didn't want to talk until it got started again. There's a little story. Someone had contacted me. They were looking for family that was in Ullensaker, which is near Oslo. And so they gave me the name of the place, and I did a little research, and I found out it was associated with the main farm called Gardermoen. For those of you who have landed at the airport, you know that the airport at Oslo is called Gardermoen, and it's named for the farm that was there before. So this is an instance where the place was kind of the victim of modern technology. And so with the advancements and the creation of airports, this farm is no longer in existence, but I told the gentleman that he could certainly visit, because all he had to do was get on a plane and fly to Oslo. But he could then walk on the ground where his ancestors walked, but as far as the vestiges of the farm being there, those had disappeared when the airport was constructed. And there are place names that have changed completely, and as well as this also, if someone is looking at someone who emigrated and then changed their name, their surname to something completely different, it can be a challenge to track those people, those individuals who changed their names back to what their name was when they lived in Norway. So it always depends upon the information that's provided in terms of how long it takes to locate an individual or a family in a Bygdebok. So now I'm just going to show a couple of examples, and these are examples that I have actually received as requests from individuals. So this first one, the person indicated that their great-grandmother, her name was Johann Onsen. And when I look at this and thinking as a genealogist, I recognize right away that her name in Norway was probably not Ellen, but some variation of that. And with her patronymic being Olsen, well, then of course her father was Oli or Ola or some other variation of that. So that's who I would probably look for. There's information that was provided that she could have come from this place called Skjeggedal in Tovdal. So when I saw that, I sort of thought that or postulated that Skjeggedal could be a farm name. It could be a main farm, and then Tovdal could be either a parish or a district in which that place is located. She emigrated in the early 1880s, but she was married in Norway before emigration. She married a man named Bert Evensen. Well, again, I look at that and I think that the name in Norway was probably different. And she may have had a brother named Knut. So that's the information that I was provided with. So the detail that I focused on was the place name. And what I did first was consult a reference work by Olaf Rygg. These were a series of books that were published in the early 1900s. Rig himself was a linguist, and what he did was create, his task basically was to chronicle the derivation of the place names, so the origins of place names for farms and maybe even some of the larger sub-farms all over the country of Norway. So this is an exhaustive work. There's 19 volumes total. We have a set of these in print. And so I use these a lot, consult them for looking for place names. So Rig created these for place name, documenting place names and how they evolved and came about. Whereas we use them as reference books to try to pinpoint where a particular farm may be located within a given district in Norway. The final volume of this set is a cumulative index, so that's where I went, and then I knew that Sjögedal could be spelled a few different ways just from my Swedish language exposure. And I found a slightly different variation in Rig in a parish called Lilla Topdal. And so here right away, you can see some of the spelling variations, not only with Topdal, but also with Sjögedal. Below on the left side is the listing from our Bygdebok website. This is from our old site before we've changed it about a year ago. But so volume 1, I could see of Omli has farms for Tovdal parish. So I know volume 1 was the right place to look. And on the right is the table of contents for volume 1 for Omli. And the numbering system here is the same as what was used by Rig. I believe that's based on a taxation system that they would number each of the main farms in an area. And so you see that numbering system used not only in Rig, but also in a lot of the Bygdebøker. So then it was just a matter of pinpointing. There was 2 farms that are Sjögedal, farm 1 and farm number 4. So I started with farm 1 and was just looking for a man named Oli or some variation of that in approximately around the mid 1800s, who may have had a daughter with a variation of a name like Ellen. And I got to page 57 and had this entry. So this is Olav Arneson, born 1830, died in 1901. In his first marriage, the second child there is Ellie, so not Ellen, as I suspected. And she was born in 1858. So the name is not Eli, it's Eli in Norwegian or something like that. So that's a female name. And she was married in 1878 to a Beruf Ivansson. And if you recall, her husband was Bert Evanson. And so this is a variation there. And it also said that she probably had a brother named Knut. Well, she did have, the next child born was named Knut, but he died as an infant. And it's very common in European countries where a child died, and if they still wanted to use the name, well, then the next child would be given that same name. So a few years later, there was another male child born. So that child was also named Knut, and he lived to an adult. So you can see that this entry is very basic. There's not a lot of detail here. There's just a few lines above in the paragraph about Olaf and his family. And then you have the household. He was actually married twice. His first wife died in 1864, and then he married another woman and had quite a few other children. But there's nothing here about Eli's emigration. but everything else matches with what's found in the requests. And then of course, a person can go back. So Olaf's father, his given name would be Are or something of that nature. There's no farm listed, so he's presumably at this same farm, and so we'd have to go through the pages to find someone who would match that name and time frame. And then for his first wife, Torah, she was from the Tveit farm. If you go back here, in the table of contents on the right, farm number 10 is Tveit, so presumably information on her ancestry would be located there. So that's how it works in this example for using other sources to pinpoint which Bygdebok to use, and then actually going through the appropriate section in the Bygdebok to locate the family of interest.
Hi, can I ask a question there?
Sure.
Do we know, or does anyone know, when it comes to farm names, you pointed out some there, sometimes there are inner, outer, nearer, and what is that in relation to? The sea, the river, the mountain? What is that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is you'll have a, you can have a middle, a lower, and upper. So I think it's more about elevation. So I think let's go back here. So yeah, Uvra, farm number 4, would be higher, and then Nedra is the lower part of Shegedal. So for some reason, I don't know if those properties abutted against each other, or if they were in just in separate areas at different elevations. And you see that down below for farms 11 and 13 as well. You have Ramsa, and you have an Uvra Ramsa, and then you have an Itra. Itra would be an outer. So, and sometimes if there's an Itra, there's an Indra, which is an inner. So yeah, you do have this based on if it's higher in the middle or lower, and then you have the outer and the inner. So I'm not sure how the outer and the inner function in relation to each other, but for the other ones, my suspicion is that it's based on elevation.
Okay, thank you.
Can I make a short comment on that too?
Sure.
Very often what happened is that you had a larger farm that ended up being split between sons as the father passed away. And at that point, they would also give it's correct that Övre and Nedre, that they would could be based on elevation and stuff like that, but it was also a way of distinguishing between the two different farms. And sometimes you ended up with Yttre or Indre and more distinction as this farm got split up.
Okay, yep, thanks. Appreciate you adding that. So any other questions at this point? All right, go on to a second example here. So this is Johann Onsen, Rustvold, and the information I was provided with had them from, that this place was located in Sør-Trøndelag. Yeah, Johann himself was born in 1803 and died in 1881. And he had at least 2 sons, one named Anders and one named Arndt. So in this case, I searched the Family Search Wiki because it does list the farms in various parishes in Norway. And at the bottom here are the search results. So there's 2 places named Rustvold in Sør-Trøndelag. One of them is in Hemne Parish and the other in Soknedal. So the question here was, well, which one is the right one? And with the information about Johann when he was born and died, my next step was to go to the Norwegian, to search the Norwegian census, the national censuses for 1801, 1865, partial for 1875, and then 1900, 1910 are on this website. of the Norwegian Historical Data Center. And I prefer using this search interface just because it provides a little more flexibility, especially depending on what information is provided. But I usually search the census here rather than on Digital Archivet, the Digital Archives of Norway website. So doing a search, I find a man named John, as we would say in English, or Johann Onsen. So again, a bit of a variation there. But you can see here at the information on the domicile that this is Hemne, and the farm Rosvold is indicated there. Jan was a widower at the time of the 1865 census, and but he did have a son named Arndt as well as one named Anders, as showed here in the household listing. Excuse me. So it indicates for all of these that they were born in Hemne. Again, there's an older spelling there for this place from the census record. And then below, we only have one Bygdebok for Hemne, and it only is for the first 27 farms, and it does not include Rosvold. So what to do next, I guess, because it wasn't in that Bygdebok. Well, what I decided to try next was to go to the church records on Digital Archivet to see if I could identify the wife of Jan, because maybe she came from a different place or from a different farm that would be included in the Bygdebok that we did have. So I looked first for the confirmation record for the son Arndt, who was born in 1827, I think it was 1827 or 1828. So I went where he was approximately 15 years old and went through the records there for Hemne, and I found him here in line number 8. The image is at an angle. That's because this page of the church book was skewed. So I wanted to kind of straighten out the entry. So that's why the image itself is at an angle. But this shows Arndt, so it's got again a little different spelling. Rosvold is there, but it says he was born in a place called Bersen instead of Hemne. But it does give the name of his parents. So there's his mother was Andrea Andersdotter. And so the next step was because he was confirmed, or because it indicated he was born in Bersen, this actually is called Bursa, is another variation of that place. It is a parish. And I found a record of their marriage in that particular parish. So for Jan and Andrea, they were born there or married there in 1828. So I kind of abandoned searching in Hemne and found instead that we did have a series of Bygdebøker for Bursa. And in the place that says Jan was from a farm called Viggen, Viggen, whereas in the book it's spelled a little bit differently. But I find this entry, the marriage record in the third column actually gives the name of his father, Arne Rasmussen. And I find Arne Rasmussen here, who lived at this place between 1793 and 1830. It lists the name of his wife and where she was from, and it actually also mentions her sister. But among the children there, at number 4 is a son Jan, born 1803, which matches the information that I was provided by the patron. And there's a note here that they moved to Hemne in 1832, and the son Arne was born in 1826, so he was actually born out of wedlock. And again, with this information now, it's possible to go back on both sides of the family, both on Arne and Ingeborg, and fill in more of the ancestry going back using this Bygdebok. So advantages of using Bygdebøker as genealogical sources. They are typically compiled from various primary sources. So they use the church records, the censuses, court records, military records, land tax records, probates. So a variety of records that are used to compile the information that's included in a Bygdebok. And a lot of times the books will include either in the front or the back a page or two listing the sources that are used. And so it can be useful to consult that and maybe copy that if you're really interested to know what they used to construct the information that's included in the book. The farm histories also will provide a context of living conditions. What I mean by that is it provides you more than just the basic genealogical facts. So more than the names and dates. So as I mentioned earlier, it can provide information about how large the property was, what kind of animals they had, what crops they grew, details like that, how the farm was acquired and such. So it gives you a more complete picture of the lives of your ancestors rather than just that basic factual information. Cross-referencing helps, is often found in these books for locating information. So you'll have the, it's called the farm surname, but it's more of an address. But when they include not only the patronymic surname, but this farm surname, so it gives you an idea of where that person, what farm that person was associated with. So then a researcher can go to that farm and then continue back another generation and then continue that process and go back as far as the records exist. These books, especially the newer ones, will a lot of times have lots of images. And so a person can find an image of a farm where an ancestor had lived, or photographs of ancestors themselves. And whenever I come across these, I always enjoy sharing those with patrons where I can find images of their own ancestors from a particular Bygdebok. And I think one advantage to these books that may not get stressed enough is that not only are these books useful for going back in time and finding ancestors going far back as the records are available, but also coming forward in time. So, for example, if a person emigrated, one can look at their siblings or at their parents' generations and then come forward in time to identify people who may still be living in Norway today who are relatives. And I don't think that's easy to find in other places because there are restrictions on records in Norway, just like we have here in the US. So privacy limits. So if a book's been published relatively recently, probably within the last 30 or 40 years, oftentimes it will include people who are still living in Norway today. And so it can be a fairly straightforward way to identify distant relatives in Norway. There are, of course, several drawbacks. The major one, of course, is the language. A lot of us here in the U.S. that are using these books are not experienced with the Norwegian language. And so that does form a bit of a challenge or hurdle. But I think if people are motivated enough to learn about their ancestors, they're going to take the time to figure out some words of Norwegian. And a lot of times with you have these entries for households, it's really not that much of a hurdle. There's not that many words to learn to really get that basic information. But of course, if there's a lot of text, well, then it becomes another issue. And there, it may be a consideration to invest in getting a quality translation done. There in Washington, D.C. area, you probably have some people who have the language skills who can probably help with that. But I think that's usually helpful if you have maybe 2 or 3 pages or several paragraphs in Norwegian about an ancestor, that it would be good to invest in getting getting quality translation performed to really understand what the information says. Another drawback is that these are considered secondary sources because they are compiled from the primary records. And so there can be mistakes. I think these mistakes are often inadvertent, but when dealing with so much factual information, it's easy for some of those mistakes to creep in. So you can have numbers, for example, in a date that could be transposed. And then maybe the name of a child instead of the name of a spouse, can happen. So it's these inadvertent mistakes that can creep in during the compilation process. It should be noted that a lot of the people who do these books are scholars. So I look at it as they do have a reputation. So they're not going to put something out there that's of relatively poor quality. So they're gonna make the effort to try to do a quality publication, but again, with so much factual information, some errors likely occur. And in some places, they've issued a subsequent booklet, or maybe on their website where they publish corrections and additions that were missed in the publication of an original book or series of books. Of course, spelling variations in place names and in personal names is something that you always have to deal with, and just the 2 examples I showed illustrate that. And maybe there's errors with those in the spelling of the names that's significant and makes it hard to find out exactly what it's supposed to be. And then finally, these books here in the US, there can be limited availability. Our collection, and I'll talk more in the next few slides about our collection, but ours is a non-circulating collection. That means the books cannot be loaned out via Interlibrary Loan. The 2 institutions that tend to loan out their Bygdebøker are the University of Minnesota Library and the University of Wisconsin Library. They tend to have more of the older books and not so many of the newer ones. And for interlibrary loan, it is important these days to check with your local library, because I think in past the practice used to be that the libraries would absorb that cost of sending a book in the mail to another library. Whereas now I think the trend is, because of budget challenges, that these libraries will now pass these costs on to the patrons. So if you are requesting a book through Interlibrary Loan, be sure to find out if there is a cost involved to you to obtain a book that way. And I know in the Library of Congress there, when I check in WorldCat to see what libraries may have a particular Bygdebok, they pop up on a regular basis. So it is possible that the books that you may need are right in your own backyard. But in other cases, you may need to make a trip. I always tell people that January is a good time of year to visit Grand Forks. But it seems like most people don't take me up on that. But No, seriously, we do have a lot of people that come through here in the summertime. Maybe they're in the area for a family reunion or something, and they'll stop in and use the books. So even though we are a university library, we are open to the public, and so people are able to come in and use the books for their own research. We have facilities for actually scanning pages from the books as well. I'm going to skip this slide because I think this information is pretty much in the handout that I included. So I'm just going to skip that, and I'll move on to just a couple of slides here at the end about our Bygdebok collection at the University of North Dakota. So our collection started back in 1980. The man seated on the left there is Dr. Arne Brekke. He was born in Norway. He came to the US and studied at Luther College in Iowa, and then went on to get a PhD in comparative Germanic languages at the University of Chicago. And he came to University of North Dakota in the 50s to teach languages. And the woman standing behind him, Colleen, she was at the time, she was an employee of our library. Her husband actually worked at our library as well. They are both, Colleen and her husband are both retired, and they live in Toledo, Ohio, but I keep in contact with her. So those two individuals, Colleen and Arne, are responsible for starting the collection. Colleen had the idea, and then she suggested it to Arne, and he was an enthusiastic supporter, and the rest, I guess, as they say, is history. The other gentleman there, Everett Knutsvig, is with our local Sons of Norway Lodge, and he's still around as well. And they're just showing some of the books that arrived back in the early days of the collection. So it started in 1980, and probably within the first couple of years, Arne decided to craft a letter in Norwegian and sent to every municipality in Norway requesting donations of books for our developing collection. And I'll back up. Back in the 60s, Arne would he started doing charter tours to Norway for, I think, started with local Sons of Norway group, and then with students at UND. And that developed within a few years into Brekke Tours and Travel. Many of you may be familiar with them because I believe they're kind of given the back cover of the Sons of Norway Viking magazine to advertise their tours to Norway. So with these charter tours, Arne had a friend. So in the letter that he sent to the municipalities in Norway, he had a friend in the Oslo area, and he requested that people send books to this contact who had a place to store the books, and then Arne would have the people who participated in his charter flights take along an extra bag, an empty bag, and so they would fill those bags with books, and that's how they got them from Norway back to Grand Forks. So it was kind of a clever way to arrange to deliver those books from Norway to our library. So after several years, another solicitation was done. So Arne again created a letter for the municipalities. And so there was 2 solicitations that were done, and that really was several hundred books that were received, and that just became the genesis of the collection from those 2 initial solicitations from the requests that were mailed. And so from then on, Arne, with his travel business, made regular trips to Norway, so he would often bring books back himself. And then in 2010, we formally dedicated the collection in his honor. So then it officially became named the Arne G. Brekke Bygdebok Collection. And about that same time, debuted our Bygdebøker website, which I'll talk about. In 2014, we surpassed 1,500 volumes, and right now we have about 1,800 volumes. It's been that way for a few years now because we closed in the fall of 2019 for our extensive renovations to our library building. So we were closed for 4 months. We opened in early February 2020, but then 6 weeks later, this thing called COVID appeared and we closed again. So essentially we were closed for nearly a year between the renovations and the pandemic. And then we reopened in time for the start of the fall semester in 2020.
Michael,
Yes.
I was just wondering if there are about 1,800 volumes that the library has now. How many don't you have? I mean, is there any missing?
Oh, yes.
Oh.
But it is a moving target because books continue to be issued and published or reprinted in Norway. My guess is there's probably maybe around 2,200 or so. So there's several hundred that we could acquire. And Arne passed away in 2018, and one of the legacies that he left is he created an endowment before he passed away. So we actually have a source of funds to use to purchase additional books. And I now have a contact in Norway to essentially serve as an agent for us. And so that's a process we're going to use moving forward to acquire additional books. So, but it is also subjective in terms of how many Bygdebøker there are, because it depends on whether a person is talking about solely about farm histories or talking about any local history publication. So if you kind of take a more generalized interpretation of what a Bygdebok is, there's many more out there than that number.
Thank you.
So that gives you a little bit of an understanding about the background of our collection. So our website initially, like I said, it was around 2009, 2010 when we debuted it. There's two purposes for creating this website. One was to list all of the books that we have in our collection. And the second was to provide some very basic information in English about each book to help our users, because many of our users are not experienced with the Norwegian language. So it's just provide some very basic information. In 2020, we were able to get a rescue grant through the COVID program. And we used part of that money to kind of reinvent our website. And so this is the new main page of our website. We had one of our Norwegian professors who needed some funding. We used some of that grant money, and he went through the books that we have categorized as general histories to look at them and see if there's any information that could be of potential interest to researchers. And so he created a spreadsheet with that information, and we included that in on our website. So just to show you what one of the destination pages looks like. So on the website itself, one can browse by place name or do a search to see what places and then the books that we have for these places. So these are the places that are prominent or are in the titles or the subtitles of the books. And sometimes we have a C reference. So sometimes you can have a book that's for more than one place. So instead of listing the books more than one time, we only try to list the books once. And so we use these C references. I'm trying to think of an example, but it's not coming to me. But if you see that in there, if it says, you know, see another place, if you go to that place, then it will have a listing of the books. So here's an example for Arland out on the west coast, right along the Sonja Fjord. There's a series of volumes here. This shows the first two. So what we did was create these categories. See that volume 1 is listed as a general book, and volume 2 is listed as a people book. So we use general, people, and farms. Those are our 3 broad categories. So if it's a general history, it falls under the category of general. If it's on a specialized topic, it falls under general. If it's an etebook, if it focuses on people, or if it's a name index, those would fall under the category of people. And then, of course, the farm histories fall under the category of farms. And sometimes you have hybrids where if a place is small enough, they may have a general history in one portion of the book, and then a farm history in another section of the book. So then we would say general and farms for categories for a book like that. So we list the title of the book. If there's multiple volumes, we indicate volume 1, volume 2, etc. The author, if known, the year of publication, the call number, which is how we use for shelving the books. And this is based on Library of Congress, the category that I mentioned. And then we also have a notes field where we can include some of those extra details if there are some that should be included to point to information in the book that could be of interest. So in this case, for this general history, we pointed out that on pages 363 to 383, so about 20 pages, that there are photographs of some community leaders there. So if someone, you know, is looking for family in Arland who are living there now, they could or live there presumably fairly recently. They could go through here and just see if there's any images of people that they might be related to. So that's why that information is included. So I think that's my last slide. So I will stop sharing. So let me go through the chat here. So some comments here. So I think here's a question from Donna. Would there be similar information, people living along the coast between, I'm not sure specifically. I'd have to look to see in terms of what information there would be in that area. So yeah, I'd have to do a little bit of research on that. Is there a similar collection for Swedish places? Yes, there is. There is a Swedish, there's a Swanson Swedish Research Center at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. That's close to where I grew up. So they're a good place to consult as far as information for Sweden. A lot of resources that they have. They are more of a private archive and genealogy research center. So they do have basically a membership for that. There are places like like in Madison for Norwegian that are private that you can use the resources if you are a member as well. So, but there are places in Swedish. I will mention that in Sweden, some places have put together books that are similar to the Norwegian Bygdebøker, although it's not as common, it's not as much of a tradition in Sweden. But I do have one area where my ancestors came from, where it does have information about individual farms and the people who lived at those farms in this parish in Sweden. So any other questions?
I could make a few comments. I've been to this library a few times myself, and Mike has helped me personally several times. It's about a 5-hour drive from Minneapolis for any of you that have not ventured as far as Grand Forks, North Dakota.
We have an airport too.
The wagon wheel ruts are all gone now. Things that I have found, they have far more than Bygdebøker, by the way. And things that have come out well for me, we're having a thumb drive, notebook and a pencil, and my laptop. You can log on to your Ancestry account, for example, right there while you're trying to canoodle your way through rabbit holes. That book scanner that you mentioned has been incredibly valuable for me. And I usually am too lazy, and I get there late morning and I end up closing the place down, wishing I would have got up out of bed sooner. Every time I get there, I'm like a kid in a candy store. There's just no end to the fun, and the day's over and Mike has to kick me out. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't let Alan stay past closing time. But we do have let me add that we do have our Bygdebok collection is in our family history room. So we have a separate room with our genealogy resources. So we do have local historical research or historical resources as well for, Grand Forks County, some of the neighboring bordering counties in Minnesota, and for North Dakota in general. So we do have some indexes, and there are, of course, databases and that online, but we have other resources. We're not just defined by our Bygdebok collection, but because so many people from Norway settled in Northeast North Dakota around Grand Forks and also in Northwest Minnesota, it just was very heavily populated by Norwegian immigrants. And so that was one of the rationales for starting this collection. And Colleen, the librarian I was talking about, she has Norwegian ancestry. So you can blame her for starting this craziness that we have.
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
I did some research at St. Olaf College. I don't know how large their collection is, but I did find some Bygdebok with my ancestors and pictures even there. So that's a little closer to Minneapolis.
Yes, a lot closer.
And my family lived in North Dakota. I grew up in North Dakota. I've written my family history, and I just wondered if any of the libraries want copies of our, I had my family history put into a little book, and Olsrud is the name of the farm in Norway that the family used as a surname when they came to America. It includes people who are still living, like myself and my siblings. And I looked at the Library of Congress. I did research there too, and looked at some of their Bygdebok. But when I looked at donations of family histories, they said they don't want anything that includes people who are still living.
Yes, I thank you for that question. Yeah, for our library, we do have in our family history room and another section, we do have donated family histories. So we have about 2 shelving units full of family histories. Some of those are from Norway, and some are just other people who have family ties to the area who have completed a family history and have chosen to donate a copy. So yeah, we would be interested. If you wish to donate a copy, we can get it cataloged and included in our holdings in our family history room. So maybe I don't think I included my contact information on the handout, but Joel and Alan and Alexis, I think, does too. They have my my email, so you could contact me, and then I could send you the mailing address to send that.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll definitely send that out if it's okay with you.
Sure.
Yeah, I think there are a handful of places in the Midwest where you could go and spend weeks and weeks researching these things. I think obviously Grand Forks is one, Madison, Wisconsin is one, the places around Minneapolis, Iowa. But yeah, I'd love to spend a week in Grand Forks, maybe in July.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if any of you are members of the Bygdebøker, these heritage societies for the geographic areas of Norway, but they have hopefully they'll be starting this year again with their Stevner, their gatherings, their annual meetings. And sometimes those organizations, they go to different sites each year. And so we have hosted them a couple of times in Grand Forks. And something I'm hoping to do, I wanted to do this in 2020 for the 40th anniversary of our collection, was to basically have a genealogy workshop. We had them, Arne helped put together a couple of those, and we had speakers from Norway and from across the US back in like 2005 or 2007, something like that. And I thought it'd be nice to organize another something along those lines for the 40th anniversary of our collection. Well, of course, with COVID, we weren't able to do that. So I'm still hoping that it's not going to happen this year, because something like that would probably take a good year of planning. So it is conceivable that we might do something next year as a sort of a genealogy workshop, and allow people time to do their own research with our collection, as well as we would have speakers from Norway and such. I'm in regular contact with Elaine Hazelton, who's president of Bygdebøkernes Fellesråd. She works at the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, so she's a good resource. And I know they did one for the Fellesråd several years ago in the Twin Cities area, where they brought in a variety of speakers to talk about aspects of Norwegian heritage and genealogy.
Sounds good.
One thing I wanted to point out, which
Thank you. Yes, I just want to say thank you.
Okay. Yep. Thanks.
You've mentioned Family Search a couple of times, and one of the interesting things there is that if you can find their page for a particular area, they often have the table of contents for the Bygdebøker in that area, which
Right.
Which is very useful.
Or at least a listing of the farms and the farm numbers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, if there aren't questions, let me quickly I wanted to bring up two things, and I see I think Carolyn Smith is still with us. Carolyn?
Yep, I'm still here.
I know that many of you have copies of Bygdebøker for areas that you're interested in. And one of the things we wanted to try to do was to put together a list of the Bygdebøker that our members own. So if you're willing to do some kind of a lookup or something like that, we can put together that list and make it available so that people can ask for information. Carolyn?
Yeah, we have some in the library, a few that just came to us. But if you'd be willing to send the name of the Bygdebøker that you have, to either Joel at genealogy or me at librarian at our lodge. We can make a list and then hopefully share some information. And I know nobody's going to part with them, but maybe if we ever can meet in person again, we could share some information, or if you'd be willing to make copies or something. Between Joel and I, we'll figure out a way to try to share some of this information.
And the one other thing is to talk about our meeting next month, which